From the News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. Nick Barris with you on this Wednesday. Yes, we are indeed in a political season. Things are heating up as we get closer to the presidential election. A lot of things on the table to talk about this morning. And we're going to open up the phone lines to invite you to join in the conversation. We'll have those up in a moment. Want to remind you also, some of you may be able to join us on Facebook at News Channel 5. If you go to Facebook page there for us, you're welcome to offer your comments and observations about some of what we're going to be talking about today. Of course, the Democratic National Convention underway, a couple of days under the belt, going on right now virtually. Next week will be the Republican National Convention. Of course, we already know sitting President Donald Trump. We know Joe Biden will be the challenger, and all the various speakers that have gone about. We can touch a bit on that. Also going to talk a little bit about some of the other things with regard to voting. All right, here in the state of Tennessee and nationwide, the role of the situation with the post office and mail-in ballots and your thoughts along those lines, and any other aspects right now, politically speaking, as we move forward. You're invited to join in the conversation with our guest this morning, who follows all of this very close, political science professor at MTSU, John Weil. Good morning to you, sir. It's nice to have you with us.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
Of course, yesterday I neglected to just say that it was a big day in Tennessee because it was the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, Tennessee playing a key role. And in keeping with that, you are wearing a tie for that moment.
I am. I have the suffragists. Little known, I found from colleagues here, it's common to call them suffragettes, but that was actually a derogatory term. Except in England. Here, they wanted to be called suffragists.
Okay.
And yes.
Remind folks, suffrage, the fact that was the phrase, women's suffrage, what did that refer to back then when that term was used?
It meant the right to vote.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what it is. And so Tennessee, of course, was the 36th state, was it not? And the last one to make sure that the votes were in place to allow that to happen. And 100 years ago then, of course, it's just hard for me to imagine, isn't it, Professor, that there was a time in this country where, various groups were not able to vote. And back then, 100 years ago, women could not vote. Just hard to believe. When now we have a vice presidential candidate who is a woman. And of course, we've had others in politics at all levels now.
Yeah, women could vote in certain states, but they didn't have the suffrage nationwide, and that was the significance. And interestingly, last night, I was telling my wife there's sort of an irony in the fact that we were 36th in line and we get the credit because we were the one that put it over the top. But if you noticed in the roll call of states last night, I believe it was Wisconsin, made a point of saying we were the first state to ratify women's suffrage. And of course, there had been other states, I want to say Kansas, but I may be mistaken, Wyoming, I believe it was. Many of the western states had already given the right to, or had given the women the right to vote. I guess it's fair to say they had earned the right to vote there, but in any case, some of them preceded those in the East.
Yeah, well, it's been interesting to watch. And again, 2020 is a year like none we've ever seen before, and I hope we never see again. But yeah, this political season with politics and especially the presidential race, just the fact that this convention is virtual. And I'm guessing, I think things may be still being worked out. We'll see what the president wants to do next week. Much of that's going to be virtual as well. I'm just curious, your observations and the feel on it. It is, to me, a different feel. You still get to hear the speeches and the speakers, but you don't have the big crowds and quite the excitement. And I don't know, it doesn't seem like quite as big a deal as in prior years.
It isn't, although in fairness, I can remember as a child, if I'm remembering correctly, the coverage extended almost through, a whole week, not just 2 or 3 hours at night. And so conventions, and for the most part, we haven't had a convention in 50 years where we've actually had a surprise. The contest last night between Biden and Sanders was hardly a nail biter. But the one thing I thought that maybe was as good or better than we usually get was the roll call of states last night. And I guess I'm enough of a geek that I always like that. You always have, I'm from the great state of this, and, we produce pecans, or we're the first state to invent the hula hoop, or, whatever it is. And I thought the notion of filming people in place certainly gave a new sort of recognition of the wideness, the variation that you have, among the U.S. states and territories.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see. Do you imagine the same thing will happen with the Republican convention next week? What have you heard about how that will go? A lot of it going to be virtual as well?
That's my understanding. I think it would look extreme, unless we get a vaccine in the next day or two. I don't think it would be very prudent for, one convention to be stressing safety and the other to be completely disregarding it. I don't know if there would be time, if they haven't already done so, to do the roll call of states in the same way that they did on site last night. I thought, again, that was a pretty nice innovation. But otherwise, I would you'll have a very different tone because you have a very different candidate, and probably a little bit more use of particularly if it's done from the White House, sort of the symbolism of the office. There's always, or almost always, an advantage when an incumbent is running, and then we'll try to, push that to the maximum.
All right, a lot of issues to talk about here, and we know what comes with conventions and a lot of speeches and talking and some attacking back and forth, and we can touch on some of that, and I'll look at some of the comments we're getting on Facebook as well as the phone calls, but wanted to kind of touch on just with regard to voting and how things are going to play out. And obviously one of the big issues over the past week was what's happening with U.S. Postal Service, the idea also that more people may be voting by mail this year depending on the state they live in and what's allowed, because of concern about going to crowds at polling places and wanting to avoid that because of the pandemic. And, we got word, of course, that, depending on what the issue is here, the Postal Service Master or Postmaster General was cutting back on equipment because the post office wasn't, profitable and it needs to make changes. And of course, others are saying some of the cuts that were being made there are going to have problems and cause problems when there's going to be a lot of mail in play come the election time. And now we learned yesterday that, all right, pulling back and going to postpone some of the changes that were planned until after the election. Your thoughts on that?
I think that's a wise decision. Of course, it's still, still leaves the possibility that you pulled out extra mailboxes and supplies from cities where, or places where you might be Democratic strongholds. So the horse may have already been out of the barn with some of it. But, there are few things in American democracy that are more important than faith in the elections. And I will say I have some concern myself. I think it's important that we try to get ballots in an expeditious fashion. And I know there was a year, maybe 2 or 3 presidential elections back, where we really didn't know the official results from either Washington or Oregon until almost a month afterwards. So my hope would be, I think there's nothing, I think mail-in ballots, particularly during an epidemic, are a wise thing to do. But I think it is important to try to get them in prior to or on the day of the election, rather than having them, come in the next 3 or 4 weeks after.
And so I guess what I'm hearing from you is that the concern is, and this is what the post office is worried about based on their resources, that things may be delayed, and that's a problem. But with regard to the issue of voter fraud, which we've heard the president say on more than one occasion, there is no clear-cut evidence of voter fraud associated with mail-in ballots. There never has been. I mean, there have been issues maybe with that, as there is with normal polling place elections at times, isolated cases. But is that not the case? My understanding is there just is not any proof to back up the claim that if there is a lot of mail-in ballots, there's going to be voter fraud.
It has about as much validity as the claim that Kamala Harris, isn't qualified to be president because she's born of immigrant parents. It's nonsense. Not to say that it could never happen, but you're right. To date, Romney was one, Senator Romney of Utah was one who was indicating that, as far as he could tell, there's a lot of speculation, a lot of charges. It's a political season, but I think we can be relatively confident that if we cast a vote in person or in ballot or through the mail, that it's going to be counted.
All right, yeah, well, and I see on Facebook a lot of people saying, oh, fraud. They're just, give me some examples of where you have that. It's just not there. I want it to be legit. And if I thought there was fraud involved with that, or, hey, we've heard plenty of times in the past concern about some of the machines out there that are done when you're doing in-person ballot voting and saying there's fraud there. And none of that's been ever clearly, I think, found. And
we often distinguish between walk and talk. The president has asked himself for a mail-in ballot. So if he's concerned, if he's really concerned that it's fraudulent, it's hard to believe that he would be casting one.
Right. So yeah, I just we're going to continue to hear it, but voting by mail is not full of fraud. Period. Choose to believe it. Say, Nick, oh, you're wrong. No. Give me proof otherwise. As you just heard, the president himself is asking for a mail-in ballot. So, all right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to take some phone calls, more of your questions and comments, and we'll get more deep into some of the other issues and some of what we've heard so far in this convention and what we can expect with the Republicans next week as well, right after this. Stay with us.